If you are a follower of Jesus, you think of church a certain way. You have a certain perception about church, don't you? And, we could talk about that. But if you're not a follower of Jesus, if you're somebody who's new to this, or you're checking it out, or you're a bit skeptical, you view the church in an entirely different way. Your perception of us is so different than our perception of ourselves. And the reason I know that, maybe this isn't true for you if you're here today, but for most of my friends and folks that I talk to who are not really church people, the perception of church when we start talking about is simply this. They're like, my problem is churches are just out for themselves. This is a perception. Churches are just looking out for themselves. They're going to take care of themselves first. They want what they want. It's a bit of an insider focused thing. And the last few years, I won't spend time going into this, but the last few years certainly reinforced that perception as we went through a lot of things and they watched how churches responded and reacted to what was going on in our community and going on in our nation. And so if you're one of those people and that's your perception, I totally understand. I wouldn't argue that you're wrong about that necessarily in general, but here's what I would tell you. I wish that I could take everybody back where you could see and experience the church in the first 300 years that the church existed. Because that kind of church and that kind of experience was entirely different. I'm going to give you one example this morning. I want to take you back to AD 260, okay? AD 260. So, I don't expect you to know your history, so let me just remind you what was happening then. In AD 260, the second great pandemic, they didn't know this, but it was getting near wrapping up. But they'd been in this pandemic for a little while. And over the last several years of this pandemic, there had been some significant loss of life all throughout the Roman Empire. There had been a food shortage, which had created a ton of problems. And then it had severely weakened the Roman army. So the second great pandemic had basically brought the Roman Empire to its knees. And there was question around, is this empire going to even survive? It was that devastating during that period of time. As a matter of fact, we have a first-person account of what was going on and the way that this pandemic, because they didn't know what caused it, and they still don't know exactly what caused it. This pandemic had a way of ripping apart the very fabric of that culture and of the relationships that existed in that culture. This first-person account alludes to this. Here's what this person wrote. They said at the first onset of the disease, they pushed, and they're talking about just general people who were living in these communities and cities. They pushed the sufferers away, and they fled from their dearest, which was just their way of saying, we didn't even take care of our loved ones. We didn't even take care of the people that we cared about the most. Everybody looked out for themselves as they were navigating through what in the world was going on with this pandemic. The writer goes on to say, throwing them, he's talking about the people who were closest to them that were infected, throwing them into the roads before they were dead because they're like, we just don't want to catch it. So imagine, you can't imagine, can you? We can't imagine our culture with everything we have. But imagine if you had no idea what created it and there was all this fear around it. All of a sudden, they're just taking the people they love the most. When they get infected with disease, they're just throwing them out in the road. They're not waiting for them to die. They're like, I just got to get you as far out of my house as I can because I don't want to catch it. And treated, he said, unburied corpses as dirt. So you die, well, too bad. We're not going to be respectful. There's not going to be some proper burial because, again, we don't want to get anywhere near it. The author goes on to write, hoping thereby to avert, this is the whole goal, right? The spread and the contagion of the fatal disease. And then he says, but do what they might, they found it difficult to escape. Now you read that and you think, oh my gosh, how barbaric. Like, why would anybody do that? But I'm telling you, if you're living in a time and in a world, you just got to put yourself in their shoes. I'm not saying it was right, but you're living in a time and a world where science is certainly not as advanced. You have no explanation for why people are dying and what's going on, and you have no way of knowing how to stop it. Well, human instinct, what's natural and normal, is to look out for yourself first. And that is what people all throughout the Roman Empire did. They looked out for themselves first because of the fear, because of the uncertainty. They had no idea what caused it. But what we do know from history is we do know who helped to stop it. We do know who stepped in the middle and cared for people nobody else would care for. So there was a man you probably have never heard of. His name was Dionysius. Dionysius was the bishop of the church in Alexandria, Egypt, okay? And Dionysius in 260, he wrote an Easter letter to a group of Christians. And he was describing what was taking place in and around the region where his church existed. And Dionysius, he painted a very different picture than what we read at first. Dionysius said this. He said, most of our brother Christians, he's talking about the people, in these churches, most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty in the middle of this pandemic. He says, never sparing themselves, thinking only of one another. He goes on to write, heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need, and, he says, they ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy, which just, that makes no sense at all. But he's like, oh yeah, they were happy to risk their lives and lose their lives to care for people. He goes on to write this. He says, for they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. And then he ends this part of the letter with these words. He says, the best of our brothers lost their lives in this manner. Now, as I read that, I thought to myself, why in the world would a group of Jesus followers be willing to care so deeply for people, in some cases that they didn't know or didn't know that well, when everybody else, when the cultural norm, and this is what you got to wrap your head around, it's not like today. The cultural norm today is we're going to care for people. The cultural norm today, because of the values of Jesus that have informed our American culture, even if you don't realize it, the cultural norm today is look out for your brother in those situations. And there's still a lot of selfishness, but it's nothing like this. The cultural norm back then was there was no expectation that you would put yourself at risk for somebody else. So why in the world would these followers of Jesus be willing to do that when not only it was unexpected, but it was not applauded and it was not celebrated? People looked at them and thought, why in the world would they make that choice? And yet they made the choice anyway. Why would they do that? That's what I want to talk about for a few minutes this morning. We're in week 3, if you haven't been with us, of our series, This is the Way. And the title comes from a term that people used to describe followers of Jesus in the first century. They were known as followers of the way because what they were primarily known for and the thing that they centered their lives around was not a religious belief system, which is a bit different than today. It's not a religious belief system. They centered their lives around the resurrection of Jesus and the way of life he introduced to the world. And so there were some core behaviors that they had that were distinguishing characteristics, if you will. They were unique marks that nobody else in that culture exhibited, that nobody else in that culture lived by, that nobody else in that culture seemed to value at all. And yet, these followers of Jesus did that. We talked about the first one last week. These followers of the way, they prioritized people far from God. It was so unusual, but they would, in their little churches, say, no, we're going to do what's best for people who don't have a relationship with God, not what's best for us. Today, I want to introduce the second core behavior to you. It's simply this: followers of the way live for their community. This is what they believed, and it's why they responded during the second great pandemic the way that they did. Because there was something they valued more than their lives, which you got to stop and wonder how they got there. But there was something they valued more than their lives. They did not fear death because they knew the one who had defeated death. And it was so close to the resurrection of Jesus that this idea that Jesus had conquered death ran so strong with them that they were like, we don't have to fear death. We're not playing the short game, We're just not going to protect our own lives. And so because they had no fear of death, when the second great pandemic hit, they had no problem stepping in and living for their communities, being for the people, even the people who didn't believe like them, and in some cases they hardly knew. They were willing to step in and demonstrate love in such a unique way. But it was because of this value that they believed their communities should be better because of their presence there. Now, where did that come from? Well, it came straight from Jesus. One day, early in Jesus' ministry, he's standing on a hillside. There's a large crowd, and he's teaching them. And this crowd, they're so curious about this new way of life. I mean, this is early on in his ministry. So he's teaching things they have never heard before, and he's teaching a way to live that is foreign to all of them. And so they're so curious about it. They're there, and they're questions, and they want to know, what this new rabbi, quote unquote, is teaching. And so Jesus unpacks this for them, and he explains exactly how this new way of life, how being a follower of his way should impact the community around them. Here's the way he put it. And for some of you, this is going to be very familiar. You've heard this before. Jesus looked at him and he said, you're the salt of the earth. And when he said that, it wasn't some random metaphor. They knew exactly what he meant, because in that culture, salt's primary usage was as a preservative. They used salt to make sure their meat and their fish didn't rot, spoil, and decay. That was the primary use for any salt. And so they knew exactly what Jesus meant when he said, well, you're the salt of the earth. He was saying, okay, if you're going to follow my way, you are going to act and function as a preservative in your community, as a preservative in your culture, as a preservative in your world. In other words, I am inviting you to live in a way that's so countercultural to the selfishness that is normal, that you will actually slow down the world around you, the community around you, from spiraling. Because you know this, and we never put it in these terms, but selfishness spirals everything downward. I mean, we understand this. This is why we have certain laws in America, right? Because we got to put some boundaries up. Because if you let everybody do what they want to do, when they want to do it, how they want to do it, if you let everybody follow their selfishness, the entire community and culture and nation eventually just spirals out of control. Everything unravels. And Jesus says, all right, I'm introducing a way of life that is going to counteract that. I'm introducing a way of life that if you follow me, you should actually be slowing down all of the negative impacts of the selfishness that comes natural to all of us. That you're like a preservative in your community. But he goes on to write, if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? He's going to, if you lose the things that make you unique, if you lose these distinguishing characteristics and behaviors, if you lose my way and you begin to live like everyone else, well then you've lost the way. And you no longer have any impact on the culture. As a matter of fact, if you just live like everybody else and look like everybody else, I don't know how you earn the trust back. This was Jesus' point. I don't know how you make any significant difference. He says it's no longer, if salt loses saltiness, it's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and to be trampled by men. It's just his way of saying, if you claim to follow me but you don't live like me, then your beliefs in me are actually no good for anybody. Now you know this intuitively, but as Christians, we've lost this over the years. We have made beliefs the center of everything. And I'm not saying beliefs aren't important, but you can believe all the right things, and that really doesn't help anybody. Beliefs don't care for the sick. Beliefs don't feed the hungry. Beliefs don't deliver grace when somebody needs it. Beliefs don't offer forgiveness when somebody least expects it. Beliefs don't demonstrate compassion. No, generosity does that. Selflessness does that. Love does that. Actions do that, but beliefs don't do any good. And this was Jesus' point. He's going, all right, if you just keep believing things about me, but you lose my way and you no longer live like me, then you've completely lost the impact you can have in your community. And then he offers a second metaphor. He says, you are the light of the world. So the implication is, well, you're living in a world that's dark. And by dark, he just meant this. You're living in a world where there are people who are trying to find purpose, and they can't find it. You're living in a world where people need compassion and grace and forgiveness and mercy, and they don't see it. You're living in a world where people are trying to figure things out and find some sense of significance and meaning, and they can't find it because it's dark, because the world is dark. The darkness is hiding. The darkness is covering up the very thing they're trying to find. That's no different than today, is it? I mean, it's people all throughout our communities are this way. And if you follow Jesus for a while, then you forget this. If you follow Jesus for a while, you get to the point where you assume, well, yeah, everybody understands and everybody knows and everybody's life is pretty much like mine. And you forget, no. There are people who desperately are trying to find hope. And they can't see hope anywhere because there's nobody showing hope to them. They're in darkness. They're desperately trying to make sense of how to raise their family and deal with those struggles and navigate through this problem, and they don't know where to go because it's dark. This is Jesus' point. He's going, all right, if you don't show the way, if you don't shine, if you don't let people see it, if you're not light in the middle of it, how are they ever going to see it? You may have it, but if you don't let them see it, it does no good to anybody. As a matter of fact, he uses another bit of a metaphor, which is a first century cultural thing. He said a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Because obviously back then they didn't have street lights, right? So if you're traveling at night, you're traveling under the light of the stars and the moon. And if it's an overcast night or a cloudy night, that's extremely difficult. So one of the things they would do is they would build certain cities up on the top of hills, and they would build them out of white limestone so that even in the middle of the night you could see it. It was like almost like a lighthouse. It was a beacon. It was a marker. And you can go, okay, I see that. I know which direction I'm going. This is what Jesus is alluding to. He's saying, all right, if you're going to follow me, here's what I want you to understand. You have been strategically placed where you are for a purpose. Now, I know it often doesn't feel like we are where we are for a reason. We are where we are, we feel like, because, well, this happened or that happened, or, I didn't understand, Jesus going, no. You're not where you are by accident. You are where you are for a reason. Jesus' point is, I am strategically placing you. People who understand what the hope and the grace and the love of God looks like, I'm strategically placing you like a city on a hill as a light for people to see. I'm strategically placing you where you are, at your workplace, at your school, in your neighborhood, on and on. Because there are people in those environments who don't know. They need to see the light. Who don't know. They need to experience God's love through you. This was his point. I'm putting you where you are for a reason. Because they desperately need it. But if you don't shine your light, then how in the world are they ever going to see it? He goes on to say, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. In other words, once you experience the light, why in the world would you go back to living like everybody else lives and, in essence, cover your light up? Why in the world would you just go back to doing what everybody else did and, pile so much of selfishness on top of your light that nobody could see it? Nobody would do that. Doesn't make any sense. Instead, he says they put it on stand. It gives light to everyone in the house. And then he makes this statement. He says, in the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see not your beliefs, not your church attendance, no. They may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Now, anytime I talk about this, I don't feel like I do an adequate job because we live in an American culture where the values of Jesus have informed how we think as a country. Even though there are plenty of people who don't believe in Jesus, the values and teachings of Jesus still inform the way you think about what you ought to value and the way people ought to behave. It's just, part of the fabric of who we are. And so because of that, we see good deeds and we think something different than what Jesus was teaching. We see good deeds and we think the kind of good deeds that good people do, and we're just used to. But Jesus is not referring to everyday American good deeds here. He's not referring to the kind of good deeds that anybody can do if they're a good person. Jesus is saying, you ought to live your life and let your light shine in such a way that they see good deeds that are so unusual and unexplainable apart from God's activity in your life. That they see the way you live and they go, why would anybody forgive like that? That's not normal. That's not everyday goodness in America. Why would anybody love somebody like that? That's not normal. You don't love people that unlovable. Why would anyone extend that kind of patience to somebody? Why would anyone give that generously or serve somebody that selflessly? That's going above and beyond. That's extreme. Jesus is going, they ought to see you living out my way of life in such a way that it causes them to stop and to go, how could, why would, something's different. And they don't come and pat you on the back and say, you are a really good person. They immediately know, no, this isn't everyday goodness. There's no other explanation for that other than that is a person who God has changed. There's no other explanation for why they would live, act, or do what they're doing. This is what Jesus is referring to. He said, your good deeds ought to be at such a level that people don't praise you, that people pause, that you're in essence putting the spotlight on Jesus and they go, only God could help somebody do that. Only God could change somebody's heart like that. Only God could make somebody that selfless. This is what he's referring to. And this is what, over the first 300 years of the church's existence, this is what they did. This is why they risked their lives and gave their lives to care for people who were sick during a pandemic when they didn't even know what was causing it. This is why, according to Dionysius, some of them died serenely happy because they were not living just for this life. They were living for something bigger. They valued something greater. And fortunately, the odds are none of us are going to ever be in their position where we've got to make the choice they made. But in our world, in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, in our schools, we do have an opportunity every day to demonstrate a character, to demonstrate a goodness, to demonstrate a love that is beyond normal, to demonstrate something that is distinct and that is different. And if people in our communities do not see that, then I'm not sure we're actually following fully the way of Jesus. We may just believe in Jesus and choose to adopt the parts of his teaching that we like. That is not what the early church did. And because of that, while people scratched their heads and couldn't figure out why in the world they were, doing what they were doing, they were drawn in by the extraordinary love that they showed. They were drawn in. And people in the first 300 years would think to themselves, I don't know that I want to be one, but my goodness, I'm so glad they're in our community. Because it's a better place because they're here. Now, it's actually not rocket science to become that kind of people, to become that kind of church. I mean, they simply practiced 3 habits. They just did it to the extreme or to the measure that Jesus had invited them to. And our habits we talk about around here all the time. You say, how do you do it? Well, you just give, serve, and love. That's how you do it. You just give, serve, and love. But not any type of giving, not good American giving. Like when you read the accounts of the early church, they practiced no strings attached generosity at a level that most of us would think was irrational. I mean, they're living in a world where they have very little themselves, and they certainly do not have the financial security that most of us have. And yet, whenever there was a need in their community, they would give to meet it. Whenever somebody was struggling financially, they'd, okay, I'll sell this to help. Whenever they heard, again, I don't know if I can explain this well, but imagine this. You're in the first century. It's not like you know people all over the place. You know the people in your little community, and that's about it. But whenever the early church would hear about a community struggling, miles and miles and miles away, people they'd never met before, we have example after example of how these early Christians would say, let's pool all our money and let's send a gift over there to help the people in that community who are struggling with a famine, to help people in that community who've gone through some natural disaster. It was extravagant, no strings attached generosity, when they had no security that they were going to be able to be taken care of themselves. But they were willing, out of their poverty in many cases, to give. That's what they were known for. So the question for those of us who are followers of Jesus, I mean, the first question I would ask you is, are you known for that? Are you known for that? Because it's one thing to do good and to give like, typical Americans give. I mean, we all give at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we see a need sometimes, we write a check, we give some money, we do whatever. We do that kind of thing. But people who aren't Christians in America do that all the time. The average American gives about 2% of their income away. The average Christian in America gives about 2% of their income away. There is zero difference. There's zero difference. So no wonder when people look at us, they go, oh, they're good people. They don't look at us and go, whoa, something's different about them. So if you're going to be a follower of the way who lives for their community, you have to figure out how to care for the people in your community. And one of the ways it gets people's attention more than anything is no strings attached generosity, because you just don't see it anymore. What should happen in our communities is that whenever people see no strings attached generosity, they should say, those Christians are so weird. There they go doing that again. That makes no sense. I don't know why they give so much of their money away. But nobody says that, do they? Why? Because we're not doing that. It ought to be the norm. They ought to be like, yep, there they go again. Instead, when they see it, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe. Instead of it being normal, it's exceptional. But it actually shouldn't be exceptional among those of us who call ourselves Christians. That generosity ought to be a distinguishing mark of who we are. And if we find ourselves in a situation where our generosity never forces us to say no to our wants and not yet to our goals, we're not anywhere close. We're just doing what the average person does. These early followers of Jesus, their generosity was extraordinary. They gave, they served. They served so selflessly. there's a tendency on our part, let's be honest, there's a tendency on all of our part to care about serving and to want to help people because, again, it's just expected and it's celebrated in our culture. But to serve to the point that it impacts our schedule, to serve to the point that it costs us something, to serve to the point that I'm putting you before me and I'm costing myself something I need or want to do in order to make time for you, that doesn't happen very often. We have a tendency, as a matter of fact, the more difficult life gets for us, the more we pull back and focus on ourselves. I've watched this for 18 years, and this is not a criticism, it is human nature. But it's actually the worst thing you can do for yourself. Because whenever life gets difficult, one of the ways that you find joy and direction in the middle of that is you continue to focus outward. And the more you focus inward, the more difficult the season becomes. Same season, but you're just focused more on all the pain and all the problems. And yet that's what we do, isn't it? The more difficult season, I don't have time to help. No, I got to focus on me. That is not what these early followers of Jesus did. Example after example, you read the history for yourself. Of the more difficult it became for them, the more they would reach out and serve someone else right in the middle of their challenge. They gave, they served, and they loved. The level of compassion, the level of patience, the level of grace, the amount of forgiveness that they demonstrated towards people, it was irrational. It was remarkable. It caught everybody off guard. Because again, they weren't demonstrating that towards people it was easy to demonstrate it towards. They were demonstrating it literally to their enemies, to the occupying forces in their cities and in their communities. But because they chose to give and serve and love the way Jesus had modeled, the way he had demonstrated, people in their communities began to lean in and not lean away. And they began to consider the way of Jesus as a different and maybe better way to live. If you wonder how this movement went from just a handful of people in Jerusalem to hundreds of thousands of people just a few hundred years later, this is why. This is why. And so my question to you, if you're a follower of Jesus, is this what you're known for? If somebody were describing you, would they say, oh my gosh, yeah, the way they give, the way they serve, the way they love, I don't understand it. I can't wrap my head around it, but it's just extraordinary. Is this what you're known for? Or when somebody looks at you, would they go, yeah, that's a good person, a real good person. But they don't see much of a difference between you and them. Listen, if you're a Christian and you want deep, that is deep. Now, none of y'all have done this, so I'm not picking on y'all, but over the years, I've had a bunch of people come up to me and say, I need something deeper, which was their nice way of saying, your sermons suck, and I would need to, that's what they were saying. And so I'll just tell them, I understand that. It's all good. But deep is not learning more. Deep is not more knowledge. You know what deep is? Deep is giving and serving and loving in such a way that you're in over your head. It's giving and serving and loving the way Jesus would, which is so far beyond what's comfortable for you that you're like, oh my gosh, if God doesn't show up and help us, I think we're going to drown. That's what deep is. You want to get in over your head, you get in over your head actually doing what Jesus taught to do, not learning more about what he taught. Just learning more. The Apostle Paul said this. He said, it puffs you up, it makes you arrogant, and it builds your ego. He said, knowledge puffs up. Love, well, it builds up. Love changes people. Love changes things. You want deep? You want to see your relationship with God go to a different level? Stop doing what's easy for you to do. Stop doing what's normal. Stop doing what good people do and try to do what Jesus would do if he were in your shoes. Try to give at that level, serve at that level, love at that level. You'll realize real quick, you got to run towards God, not away from him, or you will never make it. Now, one last thing and I'll wrap up. Here's why I wanted to talk about this today. Because some of you are probably thinking, hey, Matt, maybe you've forgotten, but we have this whole 4 thing at church, and that's what we're known for in our community. I think we do a pretty good job. You do a pretty good job. you do a pretty good job. And if that fourth thing ever became a slogan and not something we were actually doing, don't worry. I would call us all out on that in a hurry. But let me tell you something. What you don't understand is the potential you have to impact the lives of people, to be salt and light in this community, way more than you're being right now. And that's not a criticism. I'm just telling you, you don't see the potential you can have. You don't see the lives that could be impacted. Because you're living in your world and you got your lives and your jobs, and that's all fine. It's my job to sit and to think about this kind of stuff, okay? It's my job to have conversations with people who are absolutely hopeless and they're not sure there's any hope for their situation. But I'm having conversations with those people. And I know how many of you are friends with them. And I'm sitting there going, how come those people who feel like it's hopeless don't see more hope, love, joy, and generosity with their friends who come to our church? It's not that you're doing anything bad. You just don't see how extraordinary it could be. You don't see what rides on this. You don't see how important it is. And I do not have time to talk about this. But you don't see the potential you have to have an impact in other communities and in places all around the world. Churches who've heard what you're doing and the impact you're making, who are showing up here. We had one here last Sunday, wanting to see what you were doing and how you were doing it. Ask us all kinds of questions about the stuff you do in the community. Churches that are calling us and wanting to know and hear. I'm on Zoom calls with people in places all over because of the impact you're making. But listen. Our success is not measured by how many people are calling us, going, tell us how you do that. And our success is not measured by how many people are sitting in a room on a Sunday listening to me with a sermon that sucks. There didn't need to be chuckles at that point, guys. That was wrong timing. That's when everybody was supposed to go, no. Anyway, I'm just kidding. Listen, our focus isn't on how many people are sitting in a row here. Our focus is on how many people are out there who still aren't here. And they're not anywhere on Sunday morning. And they don't have a lot of hope. And things look good on the outside, but behind the scenes, it's a mess. And you want to impact them, you can't just be a good American. You can't even be a good Christian. Because quite honestly, they're really good people too. There's not a lot of difference between the two. You and I, we've got to figure out how to give and serve and love the way Jesus modeled and the way he taught. They need to see something different. They need to see a group of people who are willing to say no to themselves and not yet to their own goals because they care that much about them. When they see that, everything changes. When they see that, they don't pat us on the back. They go, only Jesus could have done that. And they check him out. So, I don't know what your next step needs to be if you call Journey Church. I don't know if your next step is to figure out how to be more generous, to serve more selflessly, to love more deeply. But I know our community needs it. And I know you have the potential, if you will take it seriously, to be used by God in this community and in communities you've never been in, to make an impact greater than you could possibly imagine. So let's not be a good church. Let's be followers of the way who live for our communities and make our communities a better place because of our presence in them. Let's not be normal good. Let's be Jesus good and give, serve, and love. Let me pray for us. Father, if we're being honest, our selfishness gets in the way of this a whole lot. And we've got to figure out how to move beyond that. So would you give us the wisdom to do it, the courage to do it? Even though we don't feel like it and we don't want to do it, help us to make the choice to give and serve and love the way you modeled, the way you instructed. Because we want to let our light shine in such a way that people see our good deeds and it puts a spotlight on you. We'll have opportunities this week to do that. Whether we're willing to trust you enough to do it remains to be seen. Help us not to miss the chance to make a bigger difference in the lives of the people around us and to know you more in the process. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.